The year was 1946. The war was over. The ticker tape parades had ended. The confetti swept from the streets of New York and Chicago and San Francisco. The speeches about freedom and democracy had faded into memory, replaced by the mundane rhythms of peacetime. Factories that had churned out tanks and planes were retooling for automobiles and refrigerators. Women who had built bombers were being pushed back into kitchens, and soldiers, millions of them, were flooding home to pick up lives they'd left behind years ago. But for thousands of black soldiers returning home to the American South, and to many parts of the North as well, the real battle was just beginning. A battle without clear enemies or front lines. A battle fought every single day in the simple act of trying to live with dignity. Elijah Carter had survived things most men only see in nightmares. He'd driven a Sherman tank through the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, where temperatures dropped so low that men lost fingers to frostbite in minutes, where German 88mm guns turned American armor into coffins of twisted metal and burning flesh. He'd watched his best friend, Marcus Webb from Detroit, burn alive when their tank took a direct hit outside Tillet, Belgium. Marcus had been singing when the shell struck, some jazz number his mother used to hum. The singing stopped instantly, replaced by screams that Eli still heard in his sleep 2 years later. He'd pulled 2 white soldiers from a burning half-track, while German machine gun fire tore up the ground around him. The bullets so close, he felt the air split beside his ear. For that act of valor, they'd pinned a bronze star on his chest in a ceremony where he wasn't allowed to stand with the white soldiers receiving their medals. They'd made the black soldiers wait until after, a separate ceremony, separate recognition, separate everything. But that medal meant nothing here. Not in Oak Ridge, Georgia, a town of maybe 3,000 souls, where cotton was still king and the old ways died hard. Not on this dusty road where 3 diners had already turned him away that morning. The first had been polite about it, apologetic even. "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you here. There's a colored diner about 5 miles down Route 23. The second had been less kind, the owner simply pointing at the sign without a word, his face hard and closed. The third had threatened to call the sheriff if Eli didn't leave immediately. So here he was, at diner number 4, his stomach empty, his canteen dry, his feet aching in boots that had walked across half of Europe and were now wearing through on Georgia asphalt. The sun beat down on his worn uniform as he stood outside Miller's Diner. The building was nothing special, just a long rectangular structure with large windows facing the main road, a gravel parking lot with a half-dozen cars, and a sign that had been repainted recently. The paint on that other sign, though, the one in the window, was fresh too. Painted in neat red letters that left no room for interpretation. Whites only. He'd seen that sign, or variations of it, 100 times since coming home 3 months ago. In bathrooms, at water fountains, at the bus station where he'd arrived, discharged from the Army with an honorable service record and $43 in his pocket. Even at the VA office where he'd gone to claim his benefits, the same benefits white veterans received without question, without suspicion, without being asked to come back later or fill out extra forms or prove they'd actually served. Eli's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle. Not from fear, though he'd be lying if he said there wasn't some of that. He'd seen what happened to black men who pushed too hard against the boundaries. He'd heard about Isaac Woodard, a sergeant who'd been beaten and blinded by police just months ago, still in his uniform on his way home from the war. He'd heard about the lynchings that had increased since the war ended, as if white America was determined to put returning black soldiers back in their place, to remind them that whatever they'd done overseas meant nothing here. No, the trembling wasn't from fear, it was from exhaustion, from hunger, from the accumulated weight of fighting for a country that refused to let him sit down for a meal, from the bone-deep tiredness that came from being treated as less than human every single day. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, a cheerful sound at odds with what followed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. A woman gasped softly. The smell of coffee and bacon hung in the air, suddenly thick with tension. The diner was about half full, maybe 15 people scattered across booths and counter stools. Working men in coveralls, a few women in house dresses, probably taking a break from shopping. An elderly couple in the corner. A businessman in a suit reading a newspaper. All white. All staring. Behind the counter stood Frank Holloway, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes. Lines that came from loss, from grief, that never quite healed. His son Tommy had died at Normandy 2 years ago, cut down by machine gun fire on Omaha Beach on the third day after the invasion. He'd been 19 years old. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a young officer who could barely meet Frank's eyes. Frank's wife Helen had collapsed when she read it. She'd never really recovered, dying of a heart attack 8 months later. The doctor said it was a weak valve, but Frank knew better. She died of a broken heart, died of losing the boy they'd raised, the child they'd loved, the future they'd planned. Frank's jaw tightened when he saw Eli standing just inside the door. Not again. This was the third time this month a black veteran had tried to come in. The first two he'd turned away quickly, firmly, without incident. Why couldn't they just understand? This wasn't personal. He had nothing against them as individuals. He'd even admired their service in an abstract way. But this was just how things were, how things had always been. The social order, the way society functioned. If he broke those rules, there would be consequences. Other business owners would turn on him. Customers would stop coming. The town council would make things difficult. His suppliers might refuse to sell to him. He could lose everything he'd built over 20 years. And for what? So one man could have a cup of coffee? He wiped his hands on his apron and stepped forward, ready to deliver the same speech he'd given before. Polite but firm. Apologetic but unyielding. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the medals on Eli's chest, dulled by dust and time but unmistakable. A bronze star, a Purple Heart. Campaign ribbons from the European theater. Maybe it was the way the young man stood, shoulders back despite obvious exhaustion, maintaining military bearing even in the face of certain rejection. Or maybe it was the scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw, a thick ropey line of damaged tissue. The kind of scar that only came from shrapnel or fire. The kind of scar that told stories of combat and survival. Sarah, Frank's daughter, stood frozen with a coffee pot in her hand near the far end of the counter. She was 19, with her mother's soft features and kind eyes, and her father's stubborn streak and strong will. She'd graduated high school in the spring of 1944, while her brother was training for the invasion. She'd been the one to answer the door when the officer came with the news about Tommy. She'd been the one who'd held her mother while she sobbed. She'd been the one who'd kept the diner running when her father couldn't get out of bed for a week. And now, looking at this soldier, this black soldier who'd clearly seen the same horrors her brother had, who wore the same kind of medals, who carried the same weight in his eyes, she felt something crack inside her chest. Something that had been building for months. A question she'd been afraid to ask. What did Tommy die for? What was the point of all that sacrifice if this was how they treated the men who'd fought beside him? Before Frank could speak, Deputy Miller stood up from his booth near the window. He was a tall man, over 6 feet, with a red face that spoke of high blood pressure and a temper to match. His badge gleamed on his chest, and his hand rested on his belt, close to his nightstick. Not on it, just close enough to send a message. He'd been sheriff's deputy for 15 years, and in that time, he'd made sure the rules were followed. The right rules. The ones that kept things orderly. The ones that kept people in their place. He'd broken up union meetings. He'd dispersed gatherings of black workers who were getting too uppity. He'd looked the other way when certain things happened to certain people. That was his job. That was how he saw it. Maintaining order. Preserving the peace. Keeping the natural hierarchy intact. The deputy's voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and contemptuous. "Boy, can you read?" He pointed at the sign in the window with exaggerated slowness as if speaking to a child. "Or did they not teach you that in the army? Because that sign there says whites only, which means you need to turn yourself around and walk right back out that door before we have a problem." Eli's eyes moved slowly from the deputy to Frank, then around the diner. An elderly woman clutched her purse tighter, as if his mere presence might inspire theft. A man in a business suit looked away quickly, uncomfortable. A young couple in the corner booth stared with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, whispering to each other. This was the moment Eli knew too well, the moment that had defined his life since returning home, the moment where he had to decide. Speak up and risk violence, arrest, or worse, stay silent and swallow another piece of his dignity, let another part of himself die inside. He'd made this calculation dozens of times since coming home. Usually, he chose silence, chose survival, chose to live another day. But today, something was different. Today, he was too tired to care about the consequences. Today, something in him had reached a breaking point. His voice, when it came, was steady, calm, the voice of a man who'd given orders under artillery fire, who'd kept his crew alive through 3 months of continuous combat. "I can read just fine, sir. I read maps in 3 languages while navigating through enemy territory in the dark. I read the faces of dying men who asked me to tell their mothers they were brave, who wanted me to promise their deaths meant something. I read the telegram that told my own mother her husband, my father, died in a factory accident in Pittsburgh while I was overseas fighting. He was making shell casings, working double shifts to support the war effort, died when a press malfunctioned. So yes, Deputy, I can read your sign. I can read it perfectly. I just thought maybe after what we all went through over there, after what we all sacrificed, things might be different. I thought maybe the country I fought for might have changed, even a little." The diner remained silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Frank felt something twist in his gut, an uncomfortable sensation he didn't want to examine too closely. This wasn't some troublemaker looking to cause a scene. This wasn't some agitator from up north trying to stir up problems. This was a soldier, a veteran, a man who'd worn the uniform, who'd earned those medals, who'd bled for the flag, just like Tommy had been, just like the boys Frank had grown up with who'd gone to Europe and the Pacific and never came back. But the rules were the rules. Society had its structure for a reason. If he broke those rules, if he gave in, there would be consequences. The other business owners would turn on him. The Merchants Association would blackball him. Deputy Miller would make sure of it. He could lose everything. Frank's voice came out harder than he intended, defensive. "Look, son, I appreciate your service. I truly do. My own boy died at Normandy, gave his life for this country, so I understand sacrifice. But I got a business to run here, and I got rules to follow. Rules that existed long before I opened this place. You understand that, don't you? It's not personal. It's nothing against you as an individual. It's just the way things are." Eli finished for him, his voice flat. "I've heard that before, sir. Heard it in Texas when I was training. Heard it in Alabama when we were shipping out. Heard it in 3 towns before I got here today. Heard it from the bus driver who made me sit in the back. Heard it from the hotel clerk who wouldn't rent me a room. Heard it from the VA officer who told me my benefits claim would take longer to process. Always the same words, just the way things are. But here's the funny thing, Mr. Holloway. I heard something different in France, in Belgium, in Germany. Over there, I could sit anywhere I wanted, could eat in the same mess halls as white soldiers, could drink from the same canteens, could use the same latrines, could sleep in the same barracks when we were pulled back from the line, could die in the same mud, bleed the same blood, cry the same tears when our friends were killed. But here, in the country I fought for, in the country I nearly died for, I can't even buy a cup of coffee, can't even sit down to rest my feet, can't even be treated like a human being." Sarah set the coffee pot down with a sharp clink that made several people jump. Her voice surprised everyone, including herself. She'd been quiet for so long, obedient, playing the role expected of her. But something in Eli's words had broken through. "Daddy, he's wearing a uniform. He's a veteran. He has medals. Tommy would have—" She stopped, her throat tightening, tears suddenly blurring her vision. But the words hung in the air, unfinished but understood. Tommy would have been ashamed. Tommy would have been angry. Tommy wouldn't have wanted this. Frank's face flushed red, a mix of anger and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. Don't you bring your brother into this, Sarah. Don't you dare. Tommy has nothing to do with this situation. This is about business, about rules, about... Tommy has everything to do with this, Sarah shot back, her voice rising, months of suppressed grief and anger finally finding an outlet. He died fighting for freedom, didn't he? That's what they told us. That's what the telegram said. That's what the officer said when he came to the door. He died so people could be free. He died fighting tyranny. He died opposing an enemy that believed some people were superior to others, based on nothing but birth. But what kind of freedom is this, Daddy? What kind of freedom says a man who fought for his country can't eat in a diner? What did Tommy die for if not for something better than this? Deputy Miller stepped forward, his patience exhausted, his hand now firmly on his nightstick. That's enough. That's quite enough. Frank, you want me to handle this? Because I can have him out of here in 10 seconds. And if he resists, well, that's resisting arrest. That's assaulting an officer. That's a whole lot of trouble for one cup of coffee. So what's it going to be, boy? You going to walk out on your own, or am I going to have to help you? Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who'd been clutching her purse, suddenly spoke up. Her voice was thin but clear, carrying an authority that came from age and social position. She was a pillar of the community, a member of the town council's wife, someone whose opinion mattered. Wait just a moment, Deputy. Before you do anything rash, I'd like to hear something. She looked at Eli, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time seeing past the color of his skin to the uniform he wore. My grandson served in the Pacific. He was in the Marines, fought at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He wrote me letters about the Negro soldiers who fought alongside them, the ammunition handlers, the supply units that kept them fed and armed under fire. He said they were brave, said they saved lives, said they did their jobs under the same fire, facing the same danger. He came home different from when he left, started asking questions about things, about why we do things the way we do, about whether the rules we follow make any sense. What unit were you with, young man? Eli's eyes met hers, surprised by the question, by the genuine interest in her voice. 761st Tank Battalion, ma'am. We fought under General Patton, Battle of the Bulge, Rhineland Campaign, Central Europe. We were called the Black Panthers, first African-American tank unit to see combat in the war. We landed in France in October 1944 and fought continuously for 183 days, saw action in 6 different countries, lost a lot of good men. The man in the business suit looked up sharply, his newspaper forgotten. His face had gone pale. The 761st. Good God, I was in the 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee Division. We fought alongside you guys at Tillet and around Bastogne. You were the ones who broke through the German lines when we were pinned down by that Panzer Division. Lost a lot of good men that day. A lot of good men. If it hadn't been for your tanks, we'd have been wiped out. The whole company. I wouldn't be sitting here right now. Something shifted in the room. The abstract was becoming concrete. This wasn't just a black man anymore, a faceless representative of a group that could be easily dismissed or feared. This was a soldier who'd fought in specific battles, who'd been in specific places, who'd done specific things that had saved specific lives. The man in the suit stood up and walked over to Eli, extending his hand. James Morrison, I was a lieutenant, 2nd Platoon, Baker Company. I owe you my life. We all do. Eli shook his hand, overwhelmed. This wasn't something he'd expected. Not here, not in Georgia. Just doing my job, sir. Same as you. Frank felt the ground shifting beneath him. His carefully constructed walls, the justifications he'd built, were developing cracks. He'd been able to maintain his position when it was abstract, when it was about rules and social order, and the way things had always been. But now it was becoming personal. Now it was becoming real. What was your specific role? He heard himself ask, his voice quieter now. Tank driver initially, Eli said, his voice taking on a different quality, the tone of someone remembering things he'd tried to forget. Drove a Sherman named Defiant. We painted it ourselves. Then I became a gunner after we lost our main gunner, Rodriguez, outside Morville-le-Vicq. He took shrapnel from an 88 that hit our turret, died before the medics could reach us. After that, I did both jobs, depending on what we needed. Drove through fire for 3 months straight, watched half my unit die, pulled men out of burning vehicles, white men, black men. Didn't matter when the shells were falling, didn't matter when someone was screaming for help. We were all just soldiers trying to stay alive, trying to keep each other alive. Frank's hand gripped the counter, his knuckles white. Tommy had been infantry. 29th Infantry Division, the blue and gray. He'd landed at Normandy on D-Day +3, wading through water still red with blood, past bodies still floating in the surf. His letters home had been sparse, heavily censored. But in one of them, one of the last ones Frank had received before the telegram came, Tommy had mentioned being saved by tank support during a German counterattack. Frank had kept that letter. Read it so many times he'd memorized every word, every line, every sentiment. We were getting torn apart, Tommy had written in his careful handwriting. Mortars falling like rain, machine guns from the hedgerows. We couldn't move forward, couldn't retreat. Thought we were done for. Then these tanks came rolling up through the smoke, started hammering the German positions, gave us cover to advance. Some of the bravest driving I've ever seen. Those tankers saved our whole company. I don't know who they were, but I won't forget it. Frank's voice came out as barely a whisper. When were you at Normandy? We weren't at the initial landing, Eli explained. The 761st arrived in France in October 1944. We landed at Omaha Beach, same place your son did, but months later. Then we were attached to Patton's Third Army. Saw action almost continuously from November through the end of the war. France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Austria. Never more than a few days' rest before we were back in combat. It wasn't the same unit. Couldn't have been the same tanks that saved Tommy. The timeline didn't match. But it could have been. That was the thing that made Frank's chest tighten, made it hard to breathe. This man standing in his diner wearing a uniform just like Tommy had worn could have been one of the soldiers who saved his son's life, even if only for a few more weeks, or saved the life of someone who fought alongside his son, or died in the same mud where his son had bled out, calling for his mother with his last breath. Deputy Miller's patience had completely run out. His face was red, veins standing out on his neck. Frank, this is getting out of hand. This is becoming a situation. I'm going to have to insist that you either tell him to leave, or I'm going to remove him. And if I have to remove him, there will be charges. Trespassing, disturbing the peace, resisting arrest if he doesn't cooperate. This has gone on long enough. No. Frank's voice was quiet but firm, surprising himself as much as anyone else. The deputy stopped mid-sentence, his mouth open. No, you're not going to do anything, Miller. Not in my diner. Not today. The deputy's face darkened to a dangerous shade of purple. Now you listen here, Frank. Listen carefully. There are laws in this state. There are customs. There are rules that keep society functioning. If you serve him, if you break those rules, you're going to have every business owner in this county coming down on you like a ton of bricks. The Merchants Association will blacklist you. Your suppliers will stop selling to you. The town council will find code violations, health violations, any damn thing they can to shut you down. And I'll be leading the charge. So you need to think very carefully about what you're doing here. I don't care. Frank looked at Eli, really looked at him, saw past the skin color to the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried in his shoulders, the pain in his stance, the same weight Tommy must have carried, the same weight all of them carried who'd seen what war really was, who'd looked into the face of death and somehow survived. He's a veteran. He served his country. He fought. He bled. He earned those medals, and I'll be damned. I'll be absolutely damned if I'm going to turn him away from my diner because of the color of his skin. My son died wearing the same uniform. My son died fighting for the same flag. And if Tommy were here, if he could see what I was about to do, he'd be ashamed of me. He'd be ashamed that I even hesitated. The diner erupted in murmurs, some angry, some shocked. Deputy Miller's face turned an even darker shade. You're making a mistake, Frank. The biggest mistake of your life. When word gets out about this, and it will get out, you're going to lose everything. Your business, your reputation, your standing in this community. Is that really worth it? For one cup of coffee? For one meal? Then let it get out, Frank said, his voice growing stronger, more certain with each word. Let them know Frank Holloway served a veteran in his diner. Let them know I looked at a man who wore the uniform, who earned those medals, who fought for this country, who bled for this country, and I treated him like the soldier he is, like the human being he is. Let them know I did what was right, even if it wasn't easy, even if it cost me everything. Sarah moved quickly, her decision made, tears streaming down her face but a smile on her lips. She grabbed a menu and a glass of water with ice. She set them in front of Eli at the counter, her hands shaking, but her voice steady. What can I get you, sir? The meatloaf is really good today. It was my mother's recipe, and the coffee is fresh. I just made a new pot. Eli stared at the menu, his vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. He'd walked into this diner expecting another rejection, another door closed in his face, another reminder that his service, his sacrifice, his pain meant nothing here in the country he'd nearly died for. But something had shifted. Something had changed. Something impossible had happened. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. Just coffee and whatever the special is, ma'am. And thank you. Thank you so much. Deputy Miller slammed his hand on the counter hard enough to make the salt shakers jump. This isn't over, Frank, not by a long shot. Not even close. You're going to regret this decision. Mark my words. By this time tomorrow, you're going to wish you'd listened to me. Maybe, Frank said, meeting the deputy's glare without flinching. But I already got plenty of regrets, Miller. I regret not spending more time with my son before he shipped out. I regret not telling him I loved him enough. I regret not telling him I was proud of him every single day. I regret not being there when he died. I regret a lot of things. But I really don't think, I'm going to regret this. The deputy stormed out, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the windows and knock a menu off the counter. The other customers sat in stunned silence. Some looked angry, their faces twisted with disapproval. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. But some, like Mrs. Patterson and James Morrison, looked thoughtful, as if seeing something for the first time, as if a veil had been lifted from their eyes. Sarah poured the coffee with steady hands now, her earlier trembling gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. Frank moved to the kitchen and started preparing a plate himself, not trusting anyone else to do it, wanting to do this one thing right. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with bacon. The same meal he'd serve anyone. The same portions. The same care. When he brought it out, he set it in front of Eli with a nod of respect. On the house, Frank said. Consider it a thank you. A long overdue thank you for your service, for your sacrifice, for everything you gave. Eli looked at the plate, then at Frank, then at Sarah, who was refilling his water glass. For a moment, none of them could speak. There was too much to say, and no words adequate enough to say it. The weight of history, the weight of injustice, the weight of change, however small, however fragile. Finally, Eli nodded, not trusting his voice. I appreciate it, sir. More than you'll ever know. As Eli ate, the tension in the diner slowly began to ease, though it didn't disappear entirely. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before, more subdued. People were processing what they'd witnessed, trying to figure out what it meant, how they felt about it. The businessman, James Morrison, finished his meal and stopped by Eli on his way out. He placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. Thank you for what you did over there. Thank you for saving my life. For saving all our lives. We couldn't have done it without soldiers like you. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it. I'm sorry for a lot of things. Mrs. Patterson left $2 on the counter, far more than her coffee and pie cost. She told Sarah quietly, for the young man's meal, and for whatever else he needs. And tell your father he did the right thing. It took courage. Real courage. the kind we don't see enough of. Over the next hour, more customers came and went. Some looked at Eli with suspicion or open disapproval, their faces hard. One man actually turned around and left when he saw Eli sitting at the counter, but others nodded in respect as they passed. A few stopped to thank him for his service. An older veteran, wearing his American Legion cap, sat down next to Eli and they talked quietly about the war, about battles and losses, about the strange feeling of coming home to a place that didn't feel like home anymore. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't even close to equality. The laws hadn't changed. The signs were still up all over town. Tomorrow, Eli would face the same discrimination, the same barriers, the same closed doors. But it was something. A crack in the wall. A small step toward recognizing that the men who'd fought together overseas, who'd bled together, who'd died together, deserved better than to be divided by arbitrary lines when they came home, deserved to be treated as the heroes they were, regardless of the color of their skin. When Eli finally finished his meal, eating slowly, savoring not just the food but the simple dignity of being served, he stood up carefully. His body ached from days of walking, from nights spent sleeping rough under bridges or in abandoned barns, from the accumulated weight of rejection and exhaustion and grief. But something felt lighter now, not fixed, not healed. The wounds were still there, still raw, but lighter somehow, as if a burden he'd been carrying had been shared, even if just for an hour. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway," Eli said, extending his hand across the counter. "Thank you for seeing me, for treating me like a person, like a soldier, like someone who matters." Frank looked at that extended hand for a long moment. In the South, in Georgia, in 1946, a white man shaking a black man's hand in public was almost as radical as serving him at a whites-only counter. It was a violation of social codes that ran deep, that had been enforced for generations. But Frank had already crossed one line today. Might as well cross another. He gripped Eli's hand firmly, feeling the calluses, the strength, the humanity. "You take care of yourself, soldier," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "And if you're ever passing through Oak Ridge again, you're welcome here. Always welcome. That's a promise." Eli nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at Frank. "Your son," he said quietly. "I didn't know him, never met him. But if he was anything like you, if he had even half your courage, he was a good man. A hell of a good man. And I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for all the losses. There were too many. Way too many." Frank's eyes burned with tears he'd been holding back for 2 years. He couldn't speak, could only nod, could only watch as this soldier, this man who'd seen too much and suffered too much, walked out into the afternoon sun. As Eli walked down the main street of Oak Ridge, he knew the road ahead was still impossibly long. There would be more whites-only signs, more doors closed, more battles to fight, this time without a tank or a rifle or a unit to back him up. But for the first time since coming home, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not that things would change overnight. Not that racism would suddenly disappear. But that they could change. That some people, when confronted with the truth, when forced to see beyond the lies they'd been taught, could choose differently, could choose better, could choose to be human. Inside the diner, Frank stood at the window, watching Eli walk away until he disappeared around a corner. Sarah came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "You're going to catch hell for this, Daddy," she said softly. "You know that, right? Tomorrow is going to be hard. Really hard." "I know," Frank replied, squeezing her hand. "But your brother didn't die so we could keep treating people like that. He didn't die so we could maintain a system that says some men are worth more than others based on nothing but the color of their skin. He died believing in something better, believing in freedom, real freedom. And maybe it's time we started living up to what he believed in. Maybe it's time we started honoring his sacrifice by actually being the country he thought he was fighting for." The next few days were exactly as difficult as Deputy Miller had promised. Maybe even worse. Some customers stopped coming, making a point of walking past the diner and going elsewhere. The town council called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. Other business owners confronted Frank, angry that he'd broken the unspoken rules, worried that it would cause problems for all of them. There were phone calls in the middle of the night, heavy breathing and threats. Someone threw a rock through the diner window with a note attached. Nigger lover. Frank found a cross burned in his yard one morning, the grass still smoking. But something unexpected happened too. Some customers came specifically because of what he'd done. Veterans mostly. Men who'd seen combat and couldn't reconcile their experiences overseas with the segregation they came home to. Men who'd fought alongside black soldiers, who'd been saved by them, who'd watched them die. They came, and they ate, and they told Frank he'd done the right thing. And slowly, very slowly, other businesses began to quietly relax their own policies. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to matter. A gas station started serving black customers at the pump instead of making them wait around back. A pharmacy stopped forcing black customers to wait until all white customers were served first. Small changes, tiny changes, but changes nonetheless. Frank never saw Elijah Carter again. He didn't know if the young veteran found work, found peace, found a place where his service was honored instead of ignored. He didn't know if Eli made it to wherever he was going, or if he fell victim to the violence that claimed so many black veterans in those years. But he thought about him often, thought about the courage it took to walk into that diner knowing what the response would likely be, thought about the dignity Eli had maintained even in the face of humiliation, thought about how his son would have felt, knowing that men who'd fought beside him, who'd bled for the same flag, were being treated as less than human back home. The road to real change was long and brutal. The Civil Rights Act wouldn't pass for another 18 years. Segregation would persist, violently defended by those who saw it as a way of life worth killing for decades more. Men and women would die fighting for basic human dignity. Churches would be bombed. Children would be murdered. Blood would be spilled in the streets. But every movement, every revolution, every transformation starts with small moments, with individuals making choices that go against the grain, with people who decide that the rules, no matter how long they've existed, no matter how many people enforce them, are wrong. Frank Holloway wasn't a civil rights hero. His name wouldn't appear in history books. He didn't march on Washington. He didn't protest or organize or lead movements. He didn't change the world. But on one hot afternoon in 1946 in a small diner in Georgia, he looked at a tired soldier and saw a human being who deserved respect. And he made a choice that rippled outward in ways he'd never fully understand, touching lives he'd never meet, inspiring changes he'd never see. Because that's how change happens. Not all at once. Not with grand gestures captured by cameras and celebrated in newspapers, but with small acts of courage, repeated over and over, person by person, choice by choice, until the walls finally come down. The war had ended in Europe and the Pacific. The guns had fallen silent, the bombs had stopped falling, but the war for dignity, for equality, for the simple right to be treated as fully human, that war was just beginning. And it would be fought not on distant battlefields with tanks and artillery, but in diners and buses and schools and voting booths across America. Fought by people like Elijah Carter, who refused to accept that their service and sacrifice meant nothing, who kept pushing forward even when every door was closed, and by people like Frank Holloway, who chose to see beyond the prejudices they'd been taught, who chose courage over comfort, who chose to do what was right even when it cost them everything. The whites-only sign stayed in Frank's window for another week. Then quietly one morning before opening, before the sun had fully risen, he took it down. He didn't make an announcement, didn't call the newspaper, didn't hold a press conference, just removed it and threw it in the trash where it belonged, where it should have been all along. Some customers noticed immediately, some complained loudly, some never came back. But Frank had made his decision. His diner would serve veterans, all veterans, because if they were good enough to die for their country, they were damn well good enough to eat in his restaurant. If they were good enough to bleed for the flag, They were good enough to be treated with basic human decency. It was a small thing. One sign, one diner, one man's choice. But small things, repeated enough times by enough people, become movements, become change, become history. And sometimes in the quiet moments late at night when the diner was closed and Frank sat alone with his memories, he'd think about Eli Carter and wonder where he was. Hope he was okay. Hope he'd found some measure of peace. And he'd think about Tommy, about the son he'd lost, and hope that somehow, somewhere, Tommy knew what his father had done, knew that his death hadn't been in vain, that his sacrifice had meant something, that the world, inch by painful inch, was becoming a little bit more like the world Tommy had believed he was fighting for. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more untold histories that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What other forgotten stories from history should we explore next? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important narratives to light. Thank you for watching.